I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all this day, morning for me, afternoon for many of you, perhaps evening for some. To this, our second session of the conference, Healing and Harm, Intersections of Trauma, Justice, and Scripture. Our first two conference sessions are focused more on areas of trauma and biblical text. And following our wonderful beginning yesterday, this one is on the theme of trauma and scriptural interpretation. Once again, our session chair is CSBB Research Associate Brandon Hurlbert, and I'll turn our time over to him in just a moment. If you're a Twitter user, again, please do feel free to live tweet through the conference. We appreciate the good press. Hashtag will be CSBBCon22, which I have now put in the chat. Before we start, at CSBB, we're very aware that the questions that we address, whether of ancient or modern violence, are not just issues of academic interest, but there are real people at the heart of these issues of trauma. And so we'd like to begin by acknowledging this, by honoring those who have suffered, who are suffering. And it's become our tradition at the conference to begin each session with lighting the candle. And I'd invite us to keep silence for about 30 seconds. And then I'll put it nearby where you'll be able to see it burning through the remainder of this session. Over to you, Brandon.
Well, hello. Welcome to the second session. Like Ash said, my name is Brandon, and I'm really excited about today's session. So welcome, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to some of you. Last night we had a great time hearing about trauma and the use of the Bible. And if you missed that, don't worry. The recordings of all our sessions will be available after the conference has finished. Our session today, as Ashley mentioned, is picking up a similar theme and slightly pivoting towards how trauma is not just something that readers bring to the text, but it's something that also informs the production of Scripture. It is a feature of the biblical narratives and poetry. And like we saw yesterday, attending to the trauma may be both illuminating for scriptural interpretation and beneficial for the life of faith. Some things to note before we begin. This session will feature two presentations, and I'll introduce our presenters in just a moment. But these two presentations will last about 40 or 45 minutes each. After each one, we'll open it up to a time of Q&A for about 15 or so minutes. And then we'll have a short comfort break in between those two presentations. If you'd like to be inputting questions as they come up into the chat during the presentation, that's fine. When it comes to the Q&A, I'll kind of scroll back through and I'll select some of them. And I might even ask you, if you feel comfortable, to unmute yourself and ask your question to the presenters directly. As we've kind of already mentioned, and I said last night, this conference is on trauma and justice. And I think it's safe to say that all of our sessions come with a content warning. There may be topics and events discussed today and during the rest of the conference that you may find too upsetting to discuss or listen to. And that is perfectly understandable. We want to be sensitive to these issues. We want you to feel safe. So if you feel like the conversation is getting too heavy, or you need to step away for a minute, or even mute us, please feel empowered to do so. So with that, I think we'll start with Brent Strawn. He had kind of a nightmare being able to kind of attend, and he actually ended up getting stuck in the Holy Land. So which means he can actually attend, but he attend the Q&A and attend the session, but he actually pre-recorded his presentation. So I'll share that on my screen in just a moment. But first, let me introduce a man who needs no introduction, but Professor Brent Strawn is Professor of Old Testament and Professor of Law at Duke University and a Senior Fellow in the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He is the author of 5 books, including The Old Testament is Dying, A Diagnosis and Recommended Treatment, The Old Testament, A Concise Introduction, and most recently, Honest to God Preaching, Talking Sin, Suffering, and Violence, published in 2021. Brent is also an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. He has appeared on CNN on matters ranging from Easter celebrations to Pope Francis to gun violence, and served as both translator and member of the editorial board for the Common English Bible. And the title of his talk today is Our Trauma and God's Body, Another Look at the Cursing Psalms. So let me share this.
Hello there, friends. It's good to be with you. I'm Brent Strawn. I'm coming to you from my home office here in North Carolina. I want to begin by saying thank you to everyone concerned, especially Brandon Hurlbert and Ashley Hibbard, for the kind invitation to be part of this important conference. Of course, I only wish it were face-to-face in person. Alas, we are by Zoom. And I must add to that, alas, further by admitting up front that portions of the following presentation were pre-recorded. And by portions, I mean, well, all of it, I'm afraid. So with those caveats in place, let me remind you of the topic that I'm addressing right now. This title that I have given to the conference organizers is Our Trauma and God's Body, Another Look at the Cursing Psalms. And I hope that the reason for that title will be clear enough as I go, but especially at the end when I'm quite explicit about it. But I also admit that I will be drawing heavily from my recent book, Honest to God Preaching, Talking Sin, Suffering, and Violence, that was just published by Fortress Press in their Working Preacher book series just this past December 2021. And specifically, given my focus on the cursing psalms, I'll be drawing on the 4th chapter of this book, which deals with violence. So sin, suffering, violence. Violence is where I'm at, chapter 4 of the book, in case you're interested in following up further later. So to begin with, my book discusses what I call a sin, suffering, violence matrix. Those are the 3 topics I address in this book, which is about preaching, but is really about the Bible primarily, and how we might think about what the Bible says about these topics, how the Bible preaches in order to kind of make similar moves in the pulpit, but not only there, also in the pew and thinking about these difficult topics and talking about them. So the book discusses this nexus or matrix of sin, suffering, and violence, which I think are interconnected in lots of ways, but also another triad, a nexus or another matrix, if you will, of reconciliation, healing, and recovery. And the book is concerned not only with these 3 triads, but how they're related. And I think they're related, and specifically that one might move from one triad to the other through honesty. And that it is honesty, in fact, which facilitates that movement from sin to reconciliation, or from violence, from suffering to healing, or from violence to recovery. Chapter 4 of the book is specifically about violence and how honesty about violence facilitates recovery. In each chapter of the book, I address at least one narrative text from the Old Testament and one poetic text to talk about the topics. sin, suffering, or violence, and how the scripture models a kind of honesty towards that topic that facilitates the move to the second triad. So in chapter 4, I am talking about violence, and I focus in on particular texts that are candid about violence in the Old Testament, and that also thereby seem to facilitate recovery from violence. These are big topics, and they are very fraught. Violence, recovery, right? Massive topics, honesty too, for that matter. And I'm the first to admit I'm just an Old Testament professor. Most of my days are spent parsing verbs. What do I know about these big things? Nevertheless, let me talk out of that expertise, or at least the love I have for the Old Testament, and see where it goes when it comes to these topics. I actually trust that you who are listening in on the conference, and my fellow participants and speakers and so forth, I trust that you will know as well or better than I do how to particularly and best apply the biblical materials and the insights they offer us to real situations on the ground. One more caveat before I get into some specifics, and that is that I think that when we speak about honesty about violence in the Bible, there's two aspects to address. One is the honesty about the violence that has been done to Israel. Israel is candid about that. And this is particularly so in, say, the Exodus events and the enslavement in Egypt. But also the second aspect is that Israel is quite honest about its own violence, its own participation in violence in particular ways, or its honesty about its famous figures who were violent. One thinks about David, for instance, who, according to the chronicler, cannot build the temple because he is a man of blood and has spilled too much blood. Now, these two types of violence done to Israel and Israel's honesty about its own violence, are different, quite different, of course. And so recovery from each is different too. But what is consistent in both types and their movement towards recovery is Israel's exemplary candor in the Bible. Exemplary in terms of laudatory. Wow, amazing. Good for you that you're able to be that honest, right? But also exemplary in terms of imitable. So I mean it in both ways, that this is exemplary, it's laudatory, amazing honesty, but also it is imitable. It can be imitated and emulated, whether that's in preaching, in pastoral care, or in personal and ecclesial piety. Okay, that's by way of introduction. So let me get now to the imprecatory Psalms proper, which I'm calling this section, God Damn It and Other Things Christians Say, or better, pray. So God damn it and other things people, particularly Christians, say, or rather better, pray. The imprecatory Psalms, as I'm sure you already know, are a sort of subset of Psalms, typically lament Psalms, that are dominated by or have extensive sections devoted to the cursing of one's enemy. Imprecation from the Latin meaning to curse. Psalm 58, 69, 79, 83, 94, 109, and 137 are usually on the list of the imprecatory Psalms, give or take a few others. Beyond that list, again, if you want me to repeat it one more time, 58, 69, 79, 83, 94, 109, and 137. Beyond that kind of core that's typically lifted up as imprecatory, there are also pieces of Psalms that include strong imprecatory words towards one's enemy. This is the case, for instance, even in that well-beloved Psalm 139, which many of you know, maybe it's one of your favorites. It's my mother-in-law's favorite Psalm. And you know, it's this one that begins with, "Oh Lord, you've searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up, you discern my thoughts from afar. I am fearfully and wonderfully made," et cetera, et cetera. But it ends with an imprecatory section. "Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God. Oh, that the bloodthirsty would depart from me, those who speak of you maliciously. Do not I hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies." So That's how the psalm ends. My mother-in-law loves the psalm, except for that last part. She doesn't, just to clarify, she doesn't love the last part. But that it shows that imprecatory elements appear in all sorts of psalms, not just the big 6 or 7 that are typically identified. And it's hard, in fact, when you think closely with the Psalms, to take those bits out. The Revised Common Lectionary and other such instruments oftentimes censor them, don't they? They put the strong words about or against the enemies in parentheses as optional reading. But they are actually embedded inextricably in these poems. So to quote C.S. Lewis in his book, Reflections on the Psalms, he says, these bad parts we don't like, they will not come away clean. You just can't rip them apart. They are bound up inextricably, Lewis says, with the most exquisite of things. Like Psalm 139 and the ending in imprecation. We could focus on any of the particular imprecatory psalms to make some of the points I'd like to try to make today. But what I'd like to do is pay some attention to 137. I hope you might have a Bible with you, but that's increasingly rare. So why don't I go ahead and at least read 137 for us, so at least we have it sort of echoing in our brains as I proceed. I'll read from the New Revised Standard Version. So here it is, Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastator. Happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. Here ends the reading, and this too is the word of the Lord. So here in this psalm, which has to be one of the more problematic texts in the Bible. I mean, there's a problematic text club, we all know, and president of the club perhaps might be Psalm 137. Even if people don't know chapter and verse, they sort of know about this psalm and its last line about bashing babies against a rock. This is a brutal psalm, and it's indicative of the imprecatory variety more generally. It's not unique. There's others like it in the Psalter, and there are other sentiments like it found elsewhere in the ancient Near East. But in any event, if we think about this psalm in light of some of the things I've already discussed, we can see that this psalm emerges first out of violence done against Israel. This psalm is one of the few that we can date with certainty. It has to be after the destruction of Jerusalem. What is remembered is Zion and destroyed Zion, and Edom's part in that, and Babylon's part in that. The exile is mentioned by the rivers of Babylon. So the violence that has been done to Israel is what calls forth this great psalm, as troubling as it may be. And that violence done against Israel leads Israel to say some things about violence in turn, and also to say some things about violence in return. So let me make 3 large points about this psalm to begin with. First, just to reiterate what I've already mentioned, Psalm 137 is about great suffering, truly deep trauma. In this way, Psalm 137 is something of a little microcosm of, say, the Book of Lamentations, which is 5 chapters. It's considerably longer than Psalm 137, but which also laments in brutal detail and great sorrow the destruction of Jerusalem. Of course, it's not just the destruction of the city or what it stands for symbolically, though all of that's quite important, but all of the accompaniments that go along with ancient and modern warfare, the atrocities done to people, to children, to people, even to animals and the environment in warfare. So first, Psalm 137 is about great suffering, the suffering that comes out of violence. So sin, suffering, violence, we know, is a kind of matrix. Sin often results in suffering, especially the sin of others against someone else. That often results in their suffering. And that often is also part of it is caused by violence. So here too, as it were, Babylon's sin has led, and its violence against Jerusalem and Israel has led to its great suffering. Second point, Psalm 137, and the same might be said for the Book of Lamentations and other similar kinds of compositions, is about, or at least a record of, verbalization about that trauma or those traumas. This is an important point, and many of you who are here at this conference know a great deal about this. But we know from the study of trauma that trauma often produces silence. It can even change brain structures, right? Affect memory, so that people who've experienced profound trauma are literally incapable, or so it seems, to speak about what they have experienced. And at the same time, the need to speak about that experience is crucial. This is the kind of conundrum or conflict or paradox of trauma, that it's impossible to speak about it. It's unspeakable, and yet somehow it must be spoken about. Denial of the event is not effective, and in fact can produce profoundly negative results, even at the immunological level, according to the work of James Pennebaker and others. So here I want to quote Judith Herman, one of the great classics on trauma, and I've cited her a number of times in my chapter in my own book. But this is what Herman says about this. Whatever the reason for silence after trauma, that silence is at best temporary because, quote, atrocities refuse to be buried, unquote. And so, Herman says, quote, equally as powerful as the desire to deny atrocities is the conviction that denial does not work. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites both for the restoration of the social order and the healing of the individual victims. Let me just repeat that crucial part again. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites both for the restoration of the social order and the healing of the individual victims. Herman calls this the conflict between denying or keeping silent about traumatic experiences and the urge to talk about them. This conflict is the central dialectic, she says, of psychological trauma. So the unspeakable can and must be spoken. That is, it must be talked about. It must be told. It must be recounted. Again, let me quote Herman here about this dialectic further. Unspeakable things can be told, and they must be told because, according to Herman, remembering, this is the quote, remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are the sine qua non for the restoration of that social order and the healing of individual victims. Okay, so must be spoken, but is unspeakable. That's the conundrum, and yet the Psalm 137 participates in that. It speaks of these unspeakable events. So it is doing the work that Herman says is necessary to move to the restoration of the social order and the healing of individual victims. In fact, in Psalm 137, if we look closely at it again, what we see here is that Israel does in fact remember. It remembers these traumatic events. What Israel remembers is Zion, verse 1. And what Israel remembers specifically is destroyed Zion, ripped down all the way to its foundations, verse 7. The psalmist weeps over that memory, verse 1, and worries that she will forget Jerusalem, and so utters a curse on herself so that she never does that. So Israel remembers that experience of profound suffering. But secondly, in Psalm 137, Israel also tells the truth about terrible events. The truth about destroyed Jerusalem, obviously, but also the truth about forced migration to Babylon, about captivity, and about cruel mockery on the part of Israel's tormentors. So Israel remembers destroyed Zion, and Israel tells the truth about terrible events. Destroyed Zion. A third observation that I'd like to make about Psalm 137 concerns verse 9, this really difficult verse that I've already cited and that we're familiar with. Happy are they who take your little ones, Babylon, and dash them against the rock. This verse seems to me lies at the confluence of required honesty toward recovery and also unspeakable trauma. Verse 9 follows verse 8. Yeah, big surprise, right? It took me a long time to figure that out. Verse 8, then verse 9. Verse 8 particularly speaks of a precise payback that the psalmist hopes for. Happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. You'll have to trust me if you don't have your Hebrew Bibles in front of you, but if you do, you'll see it for yourself. This verse 8 is kind of overfull with verbiage, nouns, and whatnot that speak to precise payback. The psalmist wants precise payback for the deed that has been done to her. And then verse 9 follows. Verse 9, following that prayer for precise payback, suggests that this last verse, verse 9, may not be simply some sort of unthinkable outburst, a case of emotions run amok or worse, but rather a calculated strike, a carefully considered request for perfect payback, a payback that's predicated on the call for justice, and that may in fact depend on the legal principle of lex talionis. That's the legal principle of an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, etc. By our standards, we oftentimes think such a legal principle is barbaric, but in the ancient world, it ensured that punishment for misdeeds was exactly precise, and it did not go too far or did not go far enough. If you knocked someone's tooth out, you got your tooth knocked out. You couldn't just buy your way out of it, or you couldn't just chip your tooth. It had to be fair. And so lex talionis, far from being barbaric, was really a way to ensure that justice was done when it came to legal principles and legal cases. The rich could not just buy their way out of some crime or misdemeanor. So that query or that question or quest for precise payback, even lex talionis, which seems to be present in verse 8, then leads right into verse 9. And that suggests there's something more going on here than just something, some sort of barbaric request. Again, emotions run amok and out of control. Let me quote from my book here. I'm on page 111. If this is true, that this is a calculated strike, a carefully considered request, that would mean that the outcome that's hoped for in the future, according to verse 9, corresponds to a prior already achieved outcome from the past. That would mean that the poet's own child or children had been bashed against a rock. If so, the sentiment found in verse 9 may become somehow less off-putting than it appeared initially, or perhaps the sentiment remains off-putting, but becomes suddenly more understandable, something that readers can more easily empathize with than they could have before. Rather than an undisciplined fit of berserker rage, verse 9 may be nothing more, but also nothing less than the words of a grief-stricken, bereaved mother who can't get that rock out of her head, the rock against which that Babylonian tormentor bashed her child to death. If so, the trauma of the psalmist is vast and deep, truly unspeakable in its horror. And perhaps that is why when that trauma is spoken of in the psalm, Psalm 9 does so rather obliquely. Emily Dickinson, you might remember, said, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant." And that may be especially true when the truth in question is truly traumatic. Telling that kind of truth is very hard. It's traumatic in its own right. And perhaps the best one can do is sort of tell it slant. And so verse 9 is suggestive, but hardly explicit in this regard. So yes, verse 9 is strong, it's shocking, it's stunning, but it's also an instance of honesty, brutal honesty to be sure. But even then, and as such, it is a move toward recovery according to Herman's 3 stages. Here, those are those stages to refresh our memories. The first stage, according to Herman, is establishment of safety. The second stage is when the survivor tells the story of their trauma completely, she says, in depth and in detail. The third stage is creating a future, according to Herman, in which the survivor has now mourned the old self that the trauma destroyed and now therefore is able to develop a new self. According to Herman's stages, stage 2, telling the story in depth and in detail is what the Old Testament so often does. In fact, I think it's one of the signal gifts of the Old Testament to the Christian canon. It's stunning candor. And in fact, indeed, repeated retelling of the traumas that Israel experienced, whether that's in Egypt and Exodus, or whether that's about the exile under Babylon or earlier under Assyria, that repeated retelling may, in fact, according to Herman, lessen the intense feelings of trauma. They attenuate over time through the course of retelling. Here I'm quoting her again. After many repetitions, the moment comes when the telling of the trauma story no longer arouses quite such intense feeling. It has become a part of the survivor's experience, but only one part of it. The story is a memory like other memories, and it begins to fade as other memories do. Her grief, too, begins to lose its vividness. It occurs to the survivor that perhaps the trauma is not the most important or even the most interesting part of her story. When the action of telling a story has come to its conclusion, the traumatic experience truly belongs to the past. So I think what we have then in the cursing Psalms, like Psalm 137, with their cries for justice and righteousness, for divine vengeance, is nothing less than a retelling unto recovery, and a retelling that will never forget. This has an effect on us, or I think it should have an effect on us who read or hear these words. Among other things, these words are a means to help us now as we think about our own traumas, or a means to help others as we think about trying to help them with theirs. That's all well and good, but there's a problem, of course, that can set recovery back or impede it. And that would be what Pennebaker calls inhibition, a resistance to tell the truth about the trauma, even if only one can tell it slant. The Old Testament counters that tendency consistently with its remarkable candor. It is anything but inhibited on this point. But an interesting question arises here that we should consider when it comes to the imprecatory Psalms, and that's the problem or issue with revenge fantasy. Revenge fantasies, of course, are when people who've experienced trauma imagine the similar or same trauma being perpetuated on their victimizers. Revenge fantasies can be a form of resistance to mourning that has to happen. They can, in fact, be a resistance to stage 2. And in that sense, if insofar as they are resistance to stage 2 and inhibition to tell the truth, even if only to tell it slant, then they are not productive and not healthy. But a few things need to be mentioned about revenge fantasies. One is that revenge fantasies aren't necessarily inhibitive. They are, in fact, completely normal, according to Herman. Lots of people have them. It's normal to have these kinds of revenge fantasies. So that's the first thing. An example that Herman herself cites is of a small women's group speaking a recovery group. And at one point, a revenge fantasy is shared. And the fantasy grew in intensity as it was shared. And several of the group members laughed with delight to hear it. And particularly the news of the victimizer finally getting what he had coming. Even the quietest and most inhibited members weren't frightened and were able to join in the laughter, Herman says. And then slowly the laughter faded and things got serious again. And in Herman's judgment, this kind of sharing process is what actually causes these fantasies to lose their intensity, so that victims are able to recognize how little they actually need revenge. So first, revenge fantasies aren't necessarily inhibited. They're normal, and they can be productive in attenuating the need for revenge. Second, Psalm 137 is explicitly not resisting mourning, right? So it's not revenge fantasy simplistically understood. It's being quite candid about its mourning. It's mourning from verse 1, and from there on out. The psalmist is candid and fully honest about their grief over Jerusalem and its fall. Thirdly, and it's something I've already touched on, this precise payback that is a mark of the Psalm 137, but also others imprecatory psalms, is really not personal at root, but a request for justice, a request for divine justice. And justice in Scripture is not the, some little minor matter, but a sublime characteristic of God. So it is that in Psalm 139, the one I've started with, that ending part is so important because the psalmist there in this imprecatory section says, "Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I consider them my enemies." So who is the psalmist cursing? Not just Joe or Judy at work, but God's own enemies. They have become the psalmist's own enemy. And in fact, that alignment that the psalmist's enemies are God's and vice versa is what will motivate God to act if God is so inclined. So again, what all this means, I think, in brief and in sum, is that brutal candor, even the brutal candor of the imprecatory psalms, so often, ignored in worship and in the Christian church more generally, at least in the West, or at least in pockets of North American Christianity with which I'm familiar. This brutal candor that marks the imprecatory psalms is actually a retelling strategy that is critical for recovery, crucial for recovery, in fact. Even the imprecatory psalms, that is, so full of rage and wrath, precisely because of their expression of that rage and wrath, offer evidence that the poets who wrote them and those who read them now are on the way to a new and different future, a new self, in Herman's words, even if we don't fully get there within the framework of any one specific poem. And so it is that honesty facilitates profound healing. And that's what I think is also at work in the movements from sin to reconciliation, or from suffering to healing. A little caveat here. In another essay, I've wondered about the way the Psalms and their brutal honesty and candor, especially about suffering, reveals a really good attachment to God, drawing on Bowlby's attachment theory. When children who have very good attachments with their parents have something bad happen to them, the first thing they do is they run to their parents and tell them. That's a sign of good attachment. When a child has something bad happen to them and they don't tell their parents, that's a sign of a poor attachment. So Israel's candor in the Psalms is a retelling strategy unto healing according to Herman's framework, but it's also a sign in sort of Bowlby's or attachment theory framework of a good attachment. And the Psalms therefore can become a means to maintain a profound attachment to God. Just as I'm suggesting here in the imprecatory Psalms, these Psalms become a means or a script by which we move from violence, traumatic experiences towards recovery. So what Psalm 137 offers is a kind of means to unburden the self, not only of its own trauma, but also, here's an interesting thing, even at the end of the Psalm, to perhaps unburden the self of its own wished for violence. The Psalm, that is, can become a script of sorts for us. That is to say, when we or anyone reads or prays this kind of text, this kind of psalm, this kind of text functions to realize the same type of disclosure in the reader or supplicant at the same time, precisely by means of this same process. So if you look at it this way, even the most intransigent of imprecatory psalms not only models full honesty, it becomes a means by which we ourselves become honest, finally, and at long last, disclosing everything, including our experiences of and feelings about violence and trauma, whether that trauma be our own or someone else's, or someone else's as our own. The psalm, therefore, can become a kind of script for us. And at that point, it might be quite good that these psalmic words are someone else's, not our own at first. We might not be able to talk about our own trauma for some time. It may not be good to talk about it initially for some time, but we might be able to take up the words of someone else's trauma and adopt it, as it were, as our own. But note well on this point, if we are not the one facing trauma or recovering from it, or if we are tasked with giving care to those who are facing trauma, but we ourselves aren't facing it other than that, even then, these kinds of psalms are a window onto another's world, another world, right? Another world and another's world. That is to say, even if we don't feel this way right now, someone else does. Someone else does. And someone else might feel a similar way even about us. So to quote one of my colleagues here at Duke Divinity School, Ellen Davis, one of the ways to think hard about the imprecatory psalms in terms of application is to rotate them 180 degrees so that they're aiming not at someone else, but at yourself, and wonder who might be praying this psalm against me and how could I live differently so they don't want to pray that anymore. Okay, that's the idea about the imprecatory psalms, honesty and recovery in a nutshell, about a 30-minute nutshell. So let me move to two conclusions. The first conclusion is this. First is that the imprecatory psalms, so often neglected, turn out to be ways to contain and constrain violence. I think that's such an important point. I want to just repeat it. These imprecatory psalms, so often neglected precisely because of their violent speech, turn out to be ways to contain and constrain violence. They do that first and foremost by means of discussing this violence, right? Telling it. Both the violence done to Israel and the violence Israel wishes for. It discusses that, but it discusses it in prayer. In prayer. This is maybe the ultimate constraint, that this sort of speech happens in the context of prayer to God. Let me quote one of my own professors, Patrick Miller, who's written eloquently about the imprecatory psalms. This is what he says. The unrestrained, justifiable but not justifiable thoughts are let loose, but within a particular framework. In this sense, the rage and brutality are not allowed to go public. They are real in this psalm, and there are terrible moments when they are real in human life. To praise such rage is at one and the same time to let it go and to hold it back. It is not now a part of our dealing with our neighbor enemy. It is a part of our life with God. The Psalms, these imprecatory Psalms with their brutal comments about their enemies, justifiable, but maybe unjustifiable. Somehow they are released in these Psalms. They're released, those sentiments are released because they must be released. Denial will not work. The repressed will return. But the violence is released safely. It's let go safely within the context of prayer. And these sentiments not only are released, they are restrained. They are restrained because they must be restrained. And they must be restrained lest violence become physical, revenge fantasy turned real. And they're restrained because they are now offered to the Lord in prayer, not offered up to our enemies with a fist or a cocked and loaded gun. It turns out, according to Scripture, Deuteronomy, cited also by Paul in Hebrews in the New Testament, that God claims sole proprietary rights on payback. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I'll be the one who repays. That's Deuteronomy 32, repeated twice by Paul and also in Hebrews. And who knows what God might do when it's God's decision. And again, quote my colleague Ellen Davis, we pray our enemies into God's hands with these prayers. But who knows what God will do with them once they're there. Maybe God will forgive our enemies, much to our disappointment. Or maybe God may not agree with us in our sentiment, much to our chagrin. In any event, what might be most profound about realizing God's proprietary ownership over payback is that at the end of the day, we don't imitate God on this point. We don't seek revenge or precise payback ourselves, but hand it over to God. God is inimitable on this point. That brings me to my second conclusion, which is to wonder about God's body and all this. So alas, to the title explicitly. It seems to me, if we think about this in somewhat imaginative mode, that what the imprecatory psalm suggests is that God's body can absorb things that our enemies' bodies cannot. If we utter this sort of speech to our enemies, it's going to come to blows, right? If we utter this sort of speech to our victimizers, it's going to come to blows. In the case of Israel in 137, they have no power anyway. They are in Babylon, oppressed by a foreign superpower, in the superpower's home capital city. They have no recourse, right? But if we do utter these things to our victimizers or to our enemies, it's going to come to blows. It's going to come to more trauma, more violence, more suffering, more sin. But uttered to God in prayer, it's as if God's body can absorb those things that our enemies' bodies cannot. And that's an intriguing point to wonder about, to reflect on. Is God is taking, as it were, the body blows that our enemies can't, either because they're unwilling or because they're unable. But furthermore, if we imaginatively stay in this mode, it doesn't, that idea doesn't mean that such prayer doesn't leave a toll, take a toll or leave a mark. And here, of course, the place to look would be Christ's body, Christ's resurrected body. Christ's wounds given to him via human violence seem to be, at least in some of the gospel accounts, permanent. They show up even in his resurrected body. Here, Thomas, put your finger in my hands and place your hand in my side. So perhaps our violence in prayer, even our violent wishes or prayers, even when they're uttered correctly, helpfully to God in prayer, maybe they leave their mark on the divine body. But if so, we might also say, so be it. Our Lord has deemed it fit to receive such blows and bear them, if only so that we and our enemies don't have to. That's my second conclusion. But here's a brief coda free of charge as I end my time. 3 texts, staccato-like, if I may. First, Romans 15:3. Romans 15:3 cites an imprecatory psalm, Psalm 69. Each of us must please our neighbor for the good purpose of building up the neighbor. For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me. That's Psalm 69. That's an imprecatory psalm in which the psalmist aligns himself or herself with God and God's enemies. Those who insult you, O Lord, have fallen on me. Therefore, take action. That's the dynamic at work. Paul cites the imprecatory psalm, Psalm 69, in verse 3, and then verse 4. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. How about that? That famous verse 4, which is quite famous. I think of it a lot in terms of the Old Testament's life in the Christian church and Christian faith and practice. That famous verse 4, speaking about such things, the segue, the introduction, the proof of it, as it were, is verse 3, where Paul cites an imprecatory psalm. Imagine that. An imprecatory psalm even written for our instruction so that we might have hope by steadfastness and the encouragement of the scriptures. More to the point of this conference, an imprecatory psalm written for our healing, for our recovery, so that we might have hope. That's a fascinating idea. And in fact, one of the more brutal of the imprecatory psalms, 58, has a introduction, a heading that says, do not destroy. That might be the tune of it, do not destroy. It's kind of an ironic superscription because the psalmist really does wish for the destruction of her enemies. But maybe that do not destroy line, according to John Goldingay, is a reminder not to destroy this psalm. This psalm has got some good stuff in it, good for our souls and for our healing. Well, speaking of Psalm 58, my second staccato-like text is precisely that. And my story here, it must be brief, but I used to read the Psalms straight through with my firstborn son. When he was younger, we read the Psalm straight through. He was quite a young tyke. And so we would ask at the end of the reading, what are the special words? One one word or two to remember, one phrase, one verse, because he was unlikely to remember much of it, if any of it, in the morning. Same is true for his dad. Psalm 58 came up. It's a brutal imprecatory psalm, and I did what parents universally do. I read the psalm quickly with zero intonation, and flatly I set it aside quickly and said goodnight. I was halfway to the door before he asked me what are the special words in Psalm 58. So I went back, turned the light back on, reopened Psalm 58, and read the last line. People will say, surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely there is a God who judges on earth. That, in a nutshell, is the dynamic of the imprecatory Psalms, that even if we've experienced profound injustice, sin, suffering, and violence, there is a God who will one day give us reconciliation, healing, and recovery, and who has begun to offer it us already in these words of candor that can be reused and taken up as our own. And that brings me to the third and final text, Psalm 76, a very interesting text with a very fascinating verse 10, which is difficult in Hebrew. I am not going to lie to you. Different translations put it different ways. I'll read to you the text in the Common English Bible. It reads this way: even human rage will turn to your praise when you dress yourself with whatever remains of your wrath. Let me just conclude, therefore, with a couple lines from my book about this verse. Even human rage turns to God's praise. Perhaps that is because God is acquainted with wrath. This is, after all, a God who's a righteous judge, according to Psalm 7, a God who's angry every single day at evil. Though the psalm discusses human rage, the talk is ultimately about God's wraths, plural, and what remains of that. God will evidently decide, according to Psalm 76:10, what to wear from the wardrobe of divine wraths on any given day. Whatever God dons will be sufficient for those who pray, whose own rage will turn to praise because God is the Lord of payback, and because that is how things work in these poems that allow us to express and limit all our many angers before the throne of mercy and judgment. And so, though Psalm 76 verse 10 remains enigmatic, there's no doubt about how this psalm ends. In light of the God who dresses up in wrath and acts against the powerful few who would flaunt divine justice and mistreat the earth's poor, perpetuate trauma ad nauseum and ad infinitum, the psalmist can only blurt out in joy and command. Make promises to the Lord your God and keep them. Let all around him bring gifts to the awesome one. He breaks the spirit of princes. He is terrifying to all the kings of the earth. Now, who honestly doesn't think that is something to rejoice about?
Well, thank you for that very stimulating and illuminating talk, Brent. We have, unfortunately, a short time for questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, raise your hand or type it into the chat. Oh, I see Helen has a question and Julie. Okay, so Helen first and then Julie can ask.
If it was me, then no, I was just applauding.
Oh,
Thank you.
Okay, we're just applauding. Okay, I see that Laura has a question. Laura, do you want to ask that question shortly?
Yeah, so I was just thinking perhaps a bit more acutely about Christ's body on the cross and the fact that he draws upon Psalm 22 sort of in his last moments, and just wondering if perhaps what he's doing is what you've suggested in terms of retelling his own trauma and his own story, and when his own words fail him, is able to draw on the richness of Scripture. I just wondered what your thoughts were around that, really.
Well, thank you. I love that idea. I wish I had thought of it. So thank you. I mean, it's really a genius idea, Lauren. I think you've seen what I failed to see, which is just that the psalm of lament and deep trauma in 22 does in fact serve as Christ's own script in his moment of dire need. 22 doesn't have quite the same, it doesn't have the imprecatory aspects quite like these other ones, but the lions, devour me, or the strong bulls of Bashan surround me, dogs, and so forth. So you do get the kind of enemy language that's common in the Psalms about one's enemies also there. So I really like that. That's a wonderful example, and it's really drawing together both the idea of the lament psalm or imprecatory psalm as script, and the psalms as attachment. I mean, it's really an intriguing way to maintain attachment. One thing that I'll say further on this, and that you probably already know, is that there's a good bit of discussion about whether or not the gospel writers are intending to evoke the entire psalm, or just the first line. If it's the first line, you get the whole tradition of the cry of dereliction, that God has turned God's back on Christ. But if the entire psalm is to be evoked, then this is the way you did cite literature in the ancient world. You cited it by its first line. And of course, there's other allusions to 22 elsewhere in the Passion. If the whole entire psalm is meant to be evoked, that psalm, like so many other lament psalms, ends in this rather remarkable statement of profound trust in God. And so that too would reflect this attachment. So I really like that comment. Thank you so much, Laura. Very helpful, insightful.
Thank you. Yeah, that was something that the dereliction, or actually is that a strong attachment in the moment of, my God, why have you forsaken me? I thought that, interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, Trevor has a question, if you'd like to unmute himself.
Yeah, a quick follow-up on that. In addition to Psalm 22, we also have Jesus citing Psalm 31, verse 5 from the cross in Luke 23, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." And Psalm 31 does indeed have imprecatory elements. It has cries for justice, but that line in particular is the psalmist's intentional and self-conscious act of entrusting himself into the hands of God for vindication. So it's an act of imprecatory nonviolence that waits on the judgment of God, which is precisely what happens in Jesus' resurrection, when the verdict of the world is overturned by the royal verdict of God. My question, though, has to do with that quote from Lewis, that the Psalms don't come away clean. And it seems to me, I wonder if you agree, that even trauma theory can't help the imprecatory Psalms come away clean. So oftentimes there's a move to internalize the dynamic forces at work in the imprecatory Psalms in a sort of therapeutic process that abstracts it from what God actually intends to do in the world. But I wonder if that won't work as cleanly as we might like. In particular, because even in Psalm 137, as you mentioned, we've got references to the Lex Talionis, but we've also got pretty overt dependence upon Isaianic prophecies about the fate of Babylon. That the Lord declares he is going to wipe out the children of Babylon. In other Psalms, we've got declarations that God will destroy the seed of the wicked so that wickedness can't continue to multiply upon the face of the earth. And even lexical overtures to something like Psalm 2, where there's an anticipated messianic anointed who shatters evildoers. It seems to me that the imprecatory Psalms are intentionally built into this matrix of expectation about God's certain action in the world, which might retain the discomfort for us of the imprecatory Psalms. And I'm wondering how you see trauma theory helping us deal with that. Does it move away from that? Can it be integrated with that sort of model as well and retain its healing capacities? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that integrative possibility.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. Appreciate it. It's nice to see you in person, see you in Zoom. We've only had some email back and forth. And if you all don't know, Trevor has written what what I think is the definitive book on the imprecatory Psalms, soon to be out with Baylor University Press. So he could answer his own question better than I could. But I'll thank you for the question, Trevor. Thank you for the comment about Psalm 31, which I think is quite right as well. Also, yeah, very important text in the Passion narrative. I think I'll say, and I think this is what you're alluding to from your own book, is what Trevor has done very nicely in his book is to talk about not just what in the world are we to do with these Psalms, but where in the world are these Psalms? And I think that's how you put it, Trevor, right? And I'm trying to do you justice. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but he's done a wonderful job at sort of placing these in the scope of salvation history or the discussion, how the Bible flows, and several of the comments Trevor just made now is helpful in that regard to see it in relationship to other Psalms and the eschatological victory of God and so on and so forth. And I think that's all quite right. I would myself think that that doesn't have to be antithetical to a more therapeutic approach. And I would think that may be my own errors of mind. It might be the influence of having a brother who's a psychotherapist and a Christian psychotherapist who thinks a lot about the integration of theology and psychology and therapy as even a means of God's grace. And so I think I would like to believe that both and that in fact what you've done with the scope of the scriptural narrative and the Psalms and so forth is genius and very, very helpful. And that also perhaps the therapeutic approach could also be integrated. Perhaps maybe we could say in a secondary way that the biblical warp and woof that you've laid out should be the primary way to think about it, but that there's also something helpful dynamically here. I don't know if I don't want to be at a sort of a theory chaser, you know what I mean? That's like, oh, now look, here's Herman, and now we can understand the lament Psalms. I rather would like to think of the lament Psalms as anticipating the insights of modern psychology by millennia, and also correcting them to some degree. So I would hope, but that's for a longer conversation for us. Maybe we can have it in Winston-Salem or something when I get back to North Carolina. But thank you, Trevor, very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's brilliant. Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, we could probably keep asking questions all day, but we have to actually move on. And I do want to give you a short comfort break. So I'm going to give you 2.5 minutes. That's 1 minute less than we got last night. But unfortunately, I do want to give Julie enough time and our questions. So I'll see you back here in 2 minutes, about 2:05, and we'll continue on.
Brent, while we're waiting, thank you so much for your paper. I loved it. And I really look forward to seeing your book. I haven't seen it yet, so yeah.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you, Julie. That means a lot coming from you. You know what you're talking about.
No.
I'm just a dab. I'm just dabbling.
I mean, we teach the same things, and sort of students wrestling with that, and and for myself, I mean, it was sort of good to. I mean, that's almost that. Don't destroy this. There's it is part of the canon. I will use that because it is part of the canon. But what do you do with it?
Yeah, it's difficult. It is difficult.
Yeah.
It's one way to go. But I did like that insight from John Goldingay. He didn't quite develop it. He didn't develop it in quite the same way I did, but just don't destroy the psalm. But why shouldn't we destroy the psalm? Maybe because it gives us this kind of resource.
Yeah, and it's difficult. I mean, and it's if our context is so. I mean, yours as well. But I mean, it's really so divisive and loaded. And what. Yeah, I don't know if you follow our news, but our university has been so in the headlines because we had a white student last week, and I mean it's again students alcohol 4:00 in the morning, but then he came back and he urinated on his black the roommates' possessions and laptop and everything, and then this guy. He was so angry, he almost wanted to hit him, but then his friend said, no, if you hit him, you're going to be in trouble. So he videotaped it and it went viral. And it's just been, I mean, and of course there's this reaction, all of that, but, the fallout, I mean, just for us, it's a sort of try and undo our racist legacy and how far we've, it's undoing a lot of the work we've done. And so then sort of the anger, the hatred about the enemies. I mean, it's sort of really, it's really real.
It's real, isn't it? I mean, yeah. Walter has this line that the vengeance and hate aren't out there somewhere else; they're in here with us.
It is,
in us.
Yeah, we just talked about it because I mean, we're so affected. Also, what happens with you on the other side of the pond? Because I mean, it's really sort of it's a war and. Sort of just what you see in Buffalo and what you see, with so many places happening. I mean, it's impacting us in a very real way because you do see some of the white students just being more militant, more, doing crazy stuff like.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah,
I hadn't heard that. I'm so sorry to hear that. Well, strength to you in that.
Yeah. Let's make a start. I just want to introduce you first, Julie. And once again, Brent, thank you so much for your paper. Really appreciate that. And we'll give a proper round of applause at the very end. So moving quite quickly along, Professor Juliana Claassens is professor in Old Testament and head of the gender unit at the Faculty of Theology, Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She is the author of several books, including Mourner, Mother, Midwife, Reimagining God's Delivering Presence in the Old Testament, Claiming Her Dignity, Female Resistance in the Old Testament, and most recently, Reading to Survive, Biblical and Contemporary Trauma Narratives in Conversation, which is out with Sheffield Phoenix Press. Her research and teaching interests include trauma hermeneutics, feminist and post-colonial interpretation of the Old Testament, one of the many reasons why we invited her. And she is also currently working on a commentary on Jonah for Old Testament Library, in which she will be reading Jonah through the lens of trauma hermeneutics as it intersects with gender, post-colonial, and queer biblical interpretation. Her title is long and it is on the screen. And I will hand that over to you, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandon, and sort of also for Helen for the invitation to be here and to share this space also with Brent. I'm Brent's and days, look how far we've gone, Brent. So it's good to be here also and keep thinking about these topics that's so important to us in different parts of the world, but sort of how we are connected. So I think that's also what I want to think about, how we connect with biblical texts, popular culture, but also different communities around the world. In the first episode of a recent Netflix series, Unbelievable, a young woman is faced with the painful task of having to recount over and over again to a range of different investigators, nurses, friends of the events associated with waking up early one morning with a masked intruder tying up and raping her. This episode, true to its title, portrays how doubt seeps into those who listen to her, as her telling and retelling of the traumatic events shifts and she increasingly gets confused as she struggles to put what she had experienced into words, even wondering at some point whether this was not merely a horrifying nightmare. This first episode from Unbelievable splendidly captures something of the disassociation, the flashbacks, and the inability to represent the unrepresentable that typically is associated with a traumatic incident such as gender-based violence. It also underscores what feminist trauma theorists have long since argued regarding the trauma of rape and sexual violence being responsible for severe fragmentation and a loss of control, as rape survivors have had their stories told by those in power. This cinematic portrayal of a young woman struggling to keep control of her own story and two dedicated detectives trying to connect the dots between a series of violations by what propound to be the same serial rapist calls to mind two other stories of rape in which the female protagonist is trying to find the words of speaking what the violators have done to her. For the purpose of this paper, and in conversation with one of the chapters of my monograph, Writing and Reading to Survive, I will focus on two other stories in which victims of rape are trying to deal with the life-altering effects of rape. In the first instance, I will focus on the way in which the metaphor of rape is employed in Lamentations 1 to capture the utter devastation and ruin experienced by the city overrun by enemy soldiers. In this portrayal of the rape of daughter Zion, we are witness to the way in which personified Zion herself and others around her are struggling to tell and retell the violation of being violated. And secondly, as part of the creative conversation cultivated in my book that seeks to bring biblical and contemporary trauma narratives into conversation, this narrative portrayal of the violation of personified Zion, which employs symbolic language to transform traumatic memories into a coherent narrative told in the form of an acrostic, centered around a singular suffering female body, is brought into conversation with yet another story of rape in the form of the South African novel Disgrace by James Coetzee, that offers a contemporary example of how traumatic events are written on the bodies of violated women, specifically the protagonist student, Melanie Isaacs, and his daughter, Lucy Lurie. I propose that insights from trauma theory may be fruitfully employed to such biblical and contemporary stories of rape as we consider the role of readers to piece together the fragmented memories associated with the traumatized characters in these biblical and contemporary trauma narratives. It will be evident in the first part of the paper that despite its semblance of order of trying to narrate the violence, the traumatic memories associated with these rape victims are piecemeal, complex, ambiguous, representing what is called in psychological terms a split self. However, trauma theory can also assist with what Melanie Bruyere describes as uprooting the morally pernicious stories told by an abusive power system, and in an act of narrative repair, replace them with identity constituting counter stories that portray group members as fully developed moral agents. This paper will, in the final section, thus seek to retrieve daughter Zion's and Lucy Lurie's respective counter stories amidst the dominant master narratives in which they find themselves. Feminist trauma theories have proposed that such counter stories serves to reclaim a sense of self, and particularly a measure of agency on the part of those female characters who have been devastated by the trauma inflicted by sexual violence. So in Lamentations 1, as elsewhere in the prophetic traditions, for instance, Jeremiah 30, Nahum 3, Isaiah 47, the metaphor of rape serves the function of capturing the tremendous violation experienced by the city and her inhabitants during and directly after the Babylonian invasion. In Lamentations 1, the distraught figure of a violated woman becomes a symbol of an invaded city whose defenses have been ravaged and its sanctuary penetrated. Far from being only a metaphor or symbol, however, the weeping, devastated woman who is desperately seeking to get the attention of anyone who would see and hear her plight represents the lives of numerous real women who have been raped in that particular war and also in many wars since. According to Alice Keys, the symbolized representation of the sexual violation of the female body represents also the social body of a society that has been devastated by military invasion. In Lamentations 1, there are numerous references to daughter Zion's sexual violation. For instance, in Lamentations 1:10, it said that the enemy forces have stretched out their hands over all her precious things. Here, hand can be considered a euphemism for penis, and it's coupled with the notion of the nations invading or entering her sanctuary. And it means demonstrates that an equation is drawn between the female body and the temple, between genitals and the inner sanctuary. It describes the rape imagery as follows. So far have things gone that even in the secret place of intimacy, to which only the single sacred partner may be admitted, the enemy has thrust himself and spread his hands over everything dear to her. In Lamentations 1:10. It is possible to read also the imagery in Lamentations 1:3 as woman Zion being pursued by attackers and overtaken between narrow places, Misharim. This context in which the translation presents itself is one of affliction, Mioni, suffered due to the enemy attack on the city. It is noteworthy that the root anah in its pure form constitutes the technical term for rape in the Hebrew Bible. According to Darren Guest, given this context, the pursuit of her and the taking of her between narrow confines may well imply sexual overtaking in a rape context. Daughter Zion is deeply affected by the violence, as also the rape victims in the series Unbelievable, which I started this presentation. We see how she's isolated, weeping uncontrollably, clearly suffering from physical and mental anguish. The severe effects of the violations upon her is evident in the claim in Lamentations 1:13 that God has made daughter Zion desolate, Shumima. It is noteworthy that a similar term is also used to describe Tamar after being raped by her brother Amnon, who in 2 Samuel 13:20 is said to live out her life as a deflowered, desolate woman without prospects in the house of her brother. This goal of the symbolic construction of the traumatic events associated with the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem is to make some sort of sense of that which defies understanding, hence framing the traumatic events in a particular way. Despite the best intentions of bringing order into a context of disorder and of seeking to control what has been nothing but chaos, the portrait of personified Zion, presented in the form of an acrostic, in itself can be said to reflect the contradiction and ambiguity associated with trauma narratives. In terms of the intersection of gender and trauma, the city of Jerusalem in the Book of Lamentations image in female terms when the suffering of the many men, women, and children are taken up in symbolic fashion in the body of a violated woman. Elizabeth Boas writes, through its evocative poetry, its aesthetic artistry, and in the interplay of voices, Lamentations models a movement from the fragmentation of individual suffering and broken narratives to the formation of a collectivity that comes together in a unified voice, joined in its recitation of shared trauma. Our first glimpse of the personified city, Jerusalem, is when we see her hunched over in grief in Lamentations 1:1. How lonely sits a city that was once full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces became a vassal. She makes a sad picture, bearing the wounds of the city and its inhabitants on her body and psyche, as in the countless stories of suffering associated with her priests in verse 4, her virgins, verse 4, her children, verse 5, her leaders, verse 6, her people, verse 7. Lamentations 1 presents us with some vivid descriptions of the effects of trauma on the women, men, and children of Jerusalem that are all taken up into the one female body of personified Zion. So the uncontrollable fits of weeping in Lamentations 1:1-2, the physical effects of trauma on the body, the churning stomach and the wrong heart in Lamentations 1:18, The nightmares and the flashbacks to harrowing memories of violence and destruction in Lamentations 1:7, 10 to 11, and 13 denote the post-traumatic symptoms associated with the suffering of the people of Jerusalem. The suffering of so many women, children, and men is encapsulated or embodied in the one suffering body of personified Zion, causing her tremendous anguish. Their wounds had become her wounds. According to Crystal Meyer, this personification of the city in female terms achieves a double representation of pain, the individual pain of any inhabitant, as well as the corporate agony of the community. These numerous stories of suffering united into a single female body, in terms of trauma theory, also can be viewed with reference to the severe trauma associated with this personified city, Jerusalem. Fragmentation, in psychological terms described as splitting, is regarded as one of the most serious effects of trauma. In the context of trauma fiction, the phenomenon of splitting is reflected in the literary techniques that portrays the effects of the extreme wounding experienced by female characters to such an extent that these characters fail to exhibit a coherent sense of self. As a destroyed and violated city, Jerusalem is not merely symbolized in singular terms as the vulnerable virgin daughter, but also as the distressed and destitute woman, the former princess, the abandoned widow, the bereaved mother. On a literary level, these fragmented identities pertain to the fact that the symbol of personified Zion is beyond simplistic understanding. It seems that in order to capture this overwhelming suffering represented by the many individual stories of pain taken up into one female body, one needs more than one image to represent the unrepresentable. In terms of trauma narratives, such an example of what Victor describes as a fractured view of himself, blown about by forces beyond one's control, living outside chronology and disconnected from the past, also is reminiscent of the severe effects of trauma on the individual psyche. Victor writes, in a trauma narrative, fragmentation is psychologically debilitating, painful, humiliating experiences and attempts to cope, disconnect individuals from the past, from significant others, and from a strong sense of self. On a collective level, personified Zion, as portrayed in Lamentations 1, is representing a multitude of severely traumatized bodies. Lacking a clear sense of self, personified Zion is depicted as a split self, torn apart by creators who have bestowed an array of fragmented identities upon her. Beyond this extreme fragmentation associated with the main character in the trauma narrative in Lamentations 1, personified Zion suffers from yet another source of injury. Amidst the utter devastation that she epitomizes, one furthermore sees how personified Zion is weighed down under the burden of constant subjection to constructions and stereotypes relating to her identity and the suffering that she is experiencing. Carly Mondolfo writes that women and indigenous people are often constructed by the words of those in power, and even when they use their own voices to speak, the dominators' words are all mixed in to a greater or lesser degree with their own words. Indeed, all women situated in patriarchal discursive contexts inevitably express themselves through the language of the dominant discourse. This dominant discourse, or one could say master narrative, goes back to deeply held beliefs that women are weak, unfaithful, and inclined to lead men astray with their shameful sexuality. These constructions are rooted in the widespread conviction that assumes that there exists a link between sin and sexuality, prevalent in much of the biblical prophets as also in the Deuteronomistic traditions. We see all of this come together in the following assertion by the narrator in Lamentations 1:18. Jerusalem sinned grievously, so she has become a mockery. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Lamentations 1:8. In Lamentations 1:9, it's furthermore said that her uncleanness is on her skirt, conceivably pointing to her menstrual condition. The reference to uncleanness can also refer to evidence of sexual intercourse that continues the association between sin and sexuality responsible for personified Zion's public humiliation. When personified Zion does speak, it is clear from the following proclamations put into her mouth that she had internalized these constructions about her. Look, O Lord, and see how worthless I have become. The Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. See, O Lord, how distressed I am. My stomach churns, my heart is wrung within me, because I have been very rebellious. In a classic essay, Hiding Behind the Naked Woman, Darren Guest considers why the author would use this disturbing metaphor to narrate the pain his people experienced after the devastating Babylonian invasion. Guest writes that for many interpreters, the personification of the city as a battered woman has been praised as a very useful device whereby a nation may be encouraged to acknowledge their guilt and also their repentance. One thus finds that the male elite members of society who were themselves held responsible for the predicament in which the capital city Jerusalem found herself, are nevertheless cast as vulnerable and depicted as a sexually violated and abused woman. In terms of trauma hermeneutics, these constructions about personified Zion, which feminist interpreters have described as blaming the victim, can be understood as being among the harmful effects of trauma. Victims and communities that have been traumatized often are shown to engage in self-blame. Individuals in these communities may hold themselves responsible for a particular disaster in an attempt to restore order into their world that has been hurled into chaos. So in a novel from many centuries later, in a very different socio-historical context, we encounter another woman, violated, raped, and living with the consequences of her humiliation. In the novel Disgraced by the Nobel Prize winner for literature, Jane Goodseer, Lucy, the daughter of the disgraced academic David Lurie, is gang raped by 3 men in an attack on a small holding in Gravestown in the Eastern Cape, which also leaves her father severely injured after being set on fire by the violators. As in the case of daughter Zion, we find in Lucy a distraught woman for a long time being unable to speak about the crime that had befallen her. In contrast to the graphic description of sexual violence that was employed to capture the city's invasion in the Book of Lamentation, the silence surrounding Lucy's rape, as well as attempts to narrate what had happened to her, is striking. Kim Middleton and Julie Townsend observed that right after the attack, neither David nor Lucy has verbalized the word rape yet. It will be many pages, many weeks in narrative time before David does. The rape occurs behind closed doors, and the reader is made privy only to David Lurie's imagining of what transpired. However, the power of suggestion is clear, and in subsequent chapters, the effect of the rape is similar to that of the violated woman in Lamentations 1. Lucy refuses comfort. She's distraught, a woman all forlorn in her disgrace. The long-term effects of the rape are particularly evident in the description offered to us by her father towards the end of the novel. She sits in her housecoat and slippers with yesterday's newspaper in her lap. Her hair hangs lank. She's overweight in a slack, unhealthy way. More and more, she has begun to look like one of the women who shuffle around the corridors of nursing homes, whispering to themselves. The shocking incident, Lucy Lurie's rape, is embedded in a larger narrative concerned primarily with Lucy's aging father, a former romantics professor forced to resign after an illicit affair with one of his students. Dealing with his growing feelings of loss of power, David Lurie seeks to come to terms with his increasingly marginalized role in a rationalized and bureaucratized world, a world in which the classics and modern language department has been downsized. In Cape Town University now is called Cape Technical University. And for all of us at universities know that the threat to the humanities and theology is real. Struggling with these feelings of being emasculated or even castrated, David Lurie engages in one sexual encounter after the one or other. Particularly disturbing is the account of David Lurie's harassing his student, Melanie Isaacs, on more than one occasion, forcing sex on the exotic and very young woman. This incident causes David to lose his teaching position when he refuses to admit wrongdoing before the university disciplinary committee. From David Lurie's sexual encounters, it's clear that for him, women serve but one purpose. This is evident in the conversation between the professor and his student when David Lurie first asked Melanie to stay the night. When she asked why, his response is because you ought to. Once again, when she asked why, he says the following: why? Because a woman's beauty does not belong to her alone. It's part of the bounty she brings into the world. She has a duty to share it. Melanie, David Lurie's student, and Lucy, his daughter, are paired in ironic fashion. In a fascinating interpretation of this novel through the lens of trauma, Chris van der Merwe and Pumla Godoba-Madikizela demonstrate that there are also connotations of rape in the sexual relationship between David Lurie and Melanie, who is depicted as passive throughout. They write in a subsequent encounter when Melanie tries to resist him, he ignores her resistance and overpowers her. The effects of this forced sexual encounter on Melanie are severe, causing her to drop out of university. Lurie's thought about the violation of his own daughter in an ironic fashion could just as well apply to Melanie. This is what their visitors have achieved. That's what they have done to this confident, modern young woman. Like a stain, the story is spearing across this district. Not her story to spread, but theirs. They are its owners. How they put her in place, how they showed her what a woman was for. As a parallel to the way in which the very real connotations of rapes were used to metaphorical effect in the Book of Lamentation, one finds in disgrace that the heartbreaking accounts of sexual violation of Melanie and Lucy are not the chief end of this contemporary trauma narrative. Once more, an author is using images of violence against women to communicate a broader political message. According to Frank England, James Coetzee in Disgrace is inscribing physical violence upon the body of one of his characters, in the process writing a strand of the socio-political reality of South Africa upon Lucy's violated body. The violation that Melanie Isaacs experienced in terms of sexual harassment that culminates in rape is instrumentalized in the ironic pairing of Lucy and Melanie, their shared experience of sexual violation. In a type of splitting of the female characters, one could argue that in some sense, Melanie is Lucy, that Lucy is Melanie. The student and the daughter of the main character are both being portrayed as vulnerable women, and specifically vulnerable daughters. Both women have to come to terms with the devastating effects of rape, not only on their bodies, but on their entire beings. And yet, this combined trauma narrative about rape and sexual harassment of two South African female characters from very different social, cultural, and racial backgrounds is appropriated in such a way that the experience of pain and suffering is overlooked and deemed to be besides the point. The character of Lucy Lurie, moreover, has the book's particular message inscribed on her violated body. She initially does not talk, only much later do we hear Lucy's voice, albeit in the voice imagined by the male author, when she speaks about the rape, saying that she was surprised at her rapist's hate for her. As she states, the shock simply doesn't go away, the shock of being hated, in the act. And yet when she falls pregnant, Lucy decides to keep the baby, a decision utterly incomprehensible to her father. David Lurie is equally perturbed by Lucy's decision to stay on the farm under the protective wing of her neighbor Beatrice, who marries her in return for her land. For Coetzee, the sexual violence in the novel serves as a means to consider difficult questions regarding redistribution of property, of restorative justice, particularly as they pertain to issues of land and ownership in the new South Africa. Even though I would argue that these are important questions, I would say that the rhetorical strategy of using the metaphor of rape as social political commentary in Disgrace is in need of serious interrogation, particularly when considering the intersection of gender and trauma. It is at this point that engagement with the biblical trauma narrative concerning the rape of daughter Zion in Lamentations 1 may be helpful. As a white South African woman myself, I must say I'm also greatly disturbed by this potential interpretation of James Coetzee's novel. This is particularly because questions of land ownership, decolonization, and retributive justice are now more important than ever, and particularly sensitive in our South African context, with its still very fragile race relationships, even more fragile now since this past week. What troubles me in relation to Disgrace, but also about Lamentations 1, is how the experience of sexual violation and women's suffering can so easily be appropriated by male authors without them noticing and considering what this does, not only to victims of such violence, but also to all women for whom experience are negated on a regular basis. The literary strategy that Guest describes as hiding behind the naked woman could well apply to both the biblical trauma narrative of the rape of daughter Zion and the disgrace of the sexual violence perpetrated against Lucy, as well as Melanie Isaacs in the same novel. It's ironic that in both trauma narratives, women, for the most part, were excluded from the political arena with no real role in decision-making, are used as the primary vehicle of the metaphor to denote, on the one hand, the blame of the collapse of the city of Jerusalem, and on the other hand, the loss of power and privilege for white male South Africans. The respective male authors of these trauma narratives from very different times and places can be said to use the bodies of women suffering physical affliction and the shame of public indignity in order to make a political theological point, in essence, evading male responsibility. However, in terms of the second objectives of this paper, it's important to omit all of the male words about them, to trying one's best to obtain a glimpse of what these traumatized women may be thinking and feeling in response to the violation they experience. Much like the detectives in Unbelievable, it takes a concerted effort to draw connections between these victims' experiences and help them to talk back to a system that are set to disadvantage them. In order for recovery to take place, traumatized characters need to regain an autonomous self and be restored to a sense of having agency after feeling paralyzed by events beyond their control. So a compelling example of retrieving daughter Zion's counter-story, hidden away amidst the dominant narrative in which she finds herself, is to be found in Colleen Mandolfo's monograph, Daughter Zion Talks Back to the Prophets. According to Mandolfo, one has to be intentional in hearing Zion's side of the story, assisted with what she describes as emancipatory reading strategies to illuminate aspects of her discourse that otherwise get pushed into the background by more conventional reading practices. For instance, in the portrayal of daughter Zion in Lamentations 1 and 2, one finds a clear movement from the objective third-person voice of the narrator to a passionate first-person voice of Zion herself. In Lamentations 1, daughter Zion repeatedly interrupts the narrator, calling upon him and especially also upon God to look and see her affliction, her plight, her distress. Also in Lamentations 1:18, daughter Zion calls upon people to hear and to see her suffering. She uses not only her words, but her whole body, as she repeatedly is said to groan, to weep, stretching out her hands in a gesture that implores people to come to her aid. Mandolfo proposes that daughter Zion, by means of such interruptions, is challenging the master narrative, found in the Hebrew Bible prophets, that she had betrayed God, and somehow deserves the violence inflicted on her by the enemy invaders. Because this master narrative is so compelling and also associated with divine authority, Mandolfo contends that daughter Zion is limited in her attempts to talk back and can do little more than to repudiate the prophetic discourse rather than positively crafting a new self-identity. Nevertheless, given the fact that this act of resistance involves laying claim to one's subjectivity, Mandolfo considers daughter Zion's the Bible's most intrepid female voice of resistance. In conversation with the rest of the Hebrew Bible prophets, we thus find how piece by piece, daughter Zion constructs an alternative identity for herself by explaining a situation from her point of view. In order to reconstruct Lucy Lurie's story, in similar fashion to the example of personified Zion in the Book of Lamentation, one has no option but to enter via the male protagonist's, male author's descriptions of her. One does so while also keeping in mind that as Michael McDonough rightly points out, neither we as the readers nor David will ever fully know Lucy's full story. In some sense, Lucy's unreadability is a clear assertion of subjectivity, a refusal to be subjugated by those men, including her father, who seeks to control her story. Yet, Disgrace does offer a sensitive portrayal of the severe effects of the rape upon Lucy's body and psyche, as well as the slow recovery of the trauma of rape, when in David's words, patiently, silently, Lucy must work her own way back from the darkness to the light. In some sense, she does. Towards the end of the novel, some sort of healing has taken place. In one of the final scenes of the novel, Lucy is shown to be working in a garden, described as follows by her father. So once she was only a little tadpole in her mother's body, and now here she is, solid in her existence, more solid than she has ever been. With luck, she will last a long time, long beyond him. When he's dead, she will, with luck, still be here doing her ordinary task among the flower beds. And from within her will have issued another existence that with luck will be just as solid, just as long-lasting. Lucy's resolve to be a good mother to the unborn child also reveals a clear sense of self. She states, I'm determined to be a good mother, David, a good mother and a good person. You should try to be a good person too. David reiterated this view of herself when responding, I suspect it's too late for me. I'm just an old lag serving out my sentence. But you go ahead, you are well on the way. One of the clearest examples in which Lucy may be said to talk back is in the letter she writes to her father in response to a letter he had put under her door, urging her once more to leave the farm. Dear David, you have not been listening to me. I'm not the person you know. I'm a dead person. I do not know yet what will bring me back to life. All I know is that I cannot go away. You do not see this, and I do not know what more I can do to make you see. Yes, the road I'm following may be the wrong one, but if I leave the farm now, I will leave defeated and will taste that defeat for the rest of my life. I cannot be a child forever. You cannot be a father forever. I know you mean well, but you are not the guide I need, not at this time. With this exchange, which David describes as Lucy's last word, one finds the clearest expression of Lucy reclaiming her sense of self. Even though feeling like a dead person, she knows for sure that defeat is not an option. The little girl, the daughter, has become a grown woman who can and will decide for herself. As she tells her father, a profound example of talking back. You behave as if everything I do is part of the story of your life. You are the main character. I'm a minor character who doesn't make an appearance until halfway through. Well, contrary to what you think, people are not divided in major and minor. I'm not a minor. I have a life of my own. Just as important to me as yours is to you. And in my life, I'm the one who makes the decisions. Lucy indeed decides to stay on the farm, a decision that is at the same time pragmatic and an expression of her identity as a true child of Africa. Daughter of a romantic poet, professor, and Dutch mother, Lucy, as her name suggests, is light and life, dedicating herself to cultivating flowers and caring for animals. Although fearful at times, she understands that her survival is connected to her ability to collaborate with the neighbors with whom she shares the land. So in conclusion, this paper has attempted to show how important it is for victims of rape to resist the stories told about them, and moreover to find their own voices to tell and reframe their own counter stories. In this process, they substitute their identity as victims of rape for that of survivors, who are able to live and love once more. Characters in the trauma narratives featured in this paper, it's also a chapter in my book, can be said to have reached varying levels of achievement of these goals. Probably the character of Lucy in Disgrace is most developed in reclaiming her sense of self in the aftermath of being raped, which includes also asserting herself over against her father and the world that he represents. As readers of trauma narratives, we continue to reconstruct these women's stories, and perhaps a little like the two detectives in the series I referenced in the beginning of this, to some respond to personified Zion's lament in Lamentations 121. They heard how I was groaning with no one to comfort me. Joining with the narrator who does see her pain and who tells her story, readers of Lamentations 1 and Disgrace are serving as witnesses to the trauma and recovery of these traumatized women, in some sense telling them, you're not alone. It is interesting that in the series Unbelievable, and please do watch it, you're done grading, it's this knowledge that there were two detectives who went all out to catch the serial rapists that also upended the life of the young woman referenced in the beginning, which had the effect of people finally believing her, that ultimately responsible for this young woman to talk back, to demand an apology, to take legal action, but most importantly, learning to drive, and at the end of the series, in the last scene, being ready and able to move on. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Julie. We have plenty of time for questions. If there's anyone that comes off. Oh, I see. Here's Kiersey really wants to ask a question.
Oh,
Please.
I
Hi,
do.
Kiersey.
Hi, Julie.
Hi.
Oh, I absolutely loved that paper and loved your book. One of the things that I was thinking while you were talking is that literally just this weekend, me and a couple of my colleagues spent the whole weekend basically teaching about sad girls and bad girls, as it was. So a lot of the not so nice stories. And one of the things that I just keep on coming across, and I still don't really know how to reconcile this, is that I love the way that we can find ways to resist the story. But what does it then do for people who actually believe in these stories? That is it just that we could just take the prophets out and just kind of burn them and just ignore them, or how, or how would you kind of deal with the image of God that then portrays? Is it just men being men and not very understanding the situation very well, or something?
Okay, let me first answer you by telling you a fun story. So when in 2014, so I moved back to my alma mater in 2010 after teaching 8 years in the United States. So went along swimmingly, teaching my heart out, asking exactly that same question. What do we do with some of these violent texts? Do we tear it out, burn it like some, that a wonderful story about the Book of Lamentations, burning the scroll, throwing it out of the window. So that I asked my first years. A couple of weeks later, I got called in front of all the church leaders of our Dutch Reforms, sort of together with my entire department, because one of the students told his mentor, who's the pastor in the town, that I threw a Bible out of the window. Actually, the story came to this one colleague asked my husband, who's also my colleague, he said, "But did Julie throw a Bible out of the window?" And he was like, "No, I don't think so, but let's." So I had to explain, no, I did not throw a Bible out of the window. It's a metaphor. And as I say, as Brent's lovely paper, don't destroy, keep it. But yeah, so it's just wonderful teaching opportunity. Also speak about metaphors, metaphor and reality, so, but yes. No, I think we would be out of our jobs, right? Because we love the Bible, and we need to wrestle with these things. We need to, and that's probably why I turned to literature also, and even Wrestling with Disgrace, which is a very complex novel. It's a male author, he's brilliant. I mean, it's great, and it's actually, as I was preparing also for this, talking about the book I've already written, sort of finding a new angle. That's also why I just watched Unbelievable this weekend, because students said you've got to watch that. So, but then I found online, I did not know this, but there's a talking back by a female author. Now I've got her name, I actually wrote it down now. Fiona Snyker, South African author, who wrote a book, Lacuna, same front cover with a dog, but sort of a different, and she writes it back, a fictional talking back, sort of and actually, when I just started reading reviews also about this, some love it, some hate it, but it's sort of a feminist engagement with Jane Coetzee, and to say, even in terms of how Lucy's story would be different, because he betrays her. It's a very male view also of rape and victim and all of that. Yeah, I just saw the Guardian's review came out a week ago, and he hates it. So, but it's going to be interesting. So I still want to read it and sort of engage with it, think about that talking back, and how we do that. And we've got to be imaginative and creative when we engage with the biblical text and using another lens. So,
great, thank you.
I think Julene has a question.
Thank you. Excuse me. So as I'd written in the chat, I just finished a class on Psalms with my master's in theology, and wrote a paper on Psalm 79, and was looking at especially the first verse, in which, see if I can get it here. oh God, the nations have come into your inheritance. Even that statement to me speaks of the rape.
Yeah.
And so I wrote that in my paper. My professor said that I did not find any reference to that being a way of talking about the rape of Jerusalem, except that the rest of the psalm goes into that, the destruction and so forth. And so, so you just said, yeah. And so I'm thinking, yes, because that same, the Hebrew wording,
it's the same as in Lamentations.
It is the same Lamentations.
There you go.
As David going into Bathsheba.
Yeah, it's entering. And I mean, it's metaphorical language, and that is, Kavina Connors, when she talks about making sense of the rape language, also in Jeremiah, she says, I mean, it is shocking, and but that's how it feels. They feel they feel violated. And I mean, and I think we see now with the war in Ukraine, I mean, some of those buildings and some of the things that happened there, and I mean, you can understand something of that violence, a violation in the most intimate. That is a sort of that's the best language they have to speak about that. In the moment, so there's a lot, and I can send you more literature on that. I mean, because a lot of people have written on this. So I can see your whole list of things to help convince your professor. But I think it's quite novel, because Brent may know, but I don't think this argument has been made about that song, that this sort of also speak about as also context of war and rape.
Right. I did not find that, that entry into Jerusalem was considered to be a rape by any of the commentaries. I mean, that you can find on Bible Hub. I was like, it's not there. It's not.
I think that might be a thesis topic, to look at some of those in the Psalms.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in and say that you might profitably compare it with some of these other texts where there's a kind of heaping up of language to clarify the nature of the sexual act, so that when the more explicit or additional language isn't present, the image is evocative, and so might be. That's not to say that it isn't sexual, right? It may still very well be sexual, but it is evocatively, so it actually might add to the power of the evocation rather than attenuate it. But there are cases where the Hebrew Bible is quite clear about a sexual violation with particular heaping up of terms, and other times where it's a little less clear, though it still may be present.
Yeah, maybe even the threat of it. I mean, because I mean, you think of a stalking. I mean, if you just see maybe a stranger or somebody at night, just that fear might be, because it's evoking what it can be.
So from what I can see in just that first line there, it starts out just with the idea of entry, and then potentially the violence, and then it just zooms right into the further destruction and so forth of and the blood in the streets and so forth. It's just full of that violence. So I was thinking, yeah, it starts there, but then it moves on.
I have a question for Julie. Just thinking about the metaphor that we've been discussing, at what point does the metaphor become move from a kind of helpful representation, a way of dealing with trauma on behalf of, or in the victim's own words, and when does the metaphor move into the kind of unhelpful, just actually adding to the violence, adding to the injury? Where is that movement, and can we find that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's sort of it is helpful and it's not helpful in that sense, and it's difficult to know where it lies, that difference, because I do think even if I mean, I think that's where the individual collective trauma may be also helpful, because even if that Lamentations, I mean, it's sort of, I guess, hiding behind the naked, it's sort of all about sort of males' violence or shame, elite men's shame. I mean, there's still behind that, that image of a female body, so a singular body that carries that. And I love what Brent also did with God's body, carrying that wounds. I mean, sort of something in there. So the moment you speak of a singular figure, but you also have all these multiple figures, and I mean, and that's the lovely thing about interpretation. I've now a student who's going to read Jeremiah 20, the prophet sort of sense in terms of violation of being enticed by God, and also Lamentation 3, but again, sort of in terms of that with male violence against men and boys, because we're so used to also reading this in terms of female violence and rape because of that. But again, in rape and war, there is a lot of male violation of often sexual. The most cases of sexual violence against men is in context like war and prisons and gang rape. So so again, we forgot. We so not focus on that. So now looking at that again. So I think it's multiple layers and levels. So constantly reinterpreting, asking, how's it helpful? How's it not helpful?
Yeah, thanks. There are other questions? Maybe we can open up the conversation to Brent's paper as well. If you had follow-up questions from that, or maybe some interesting things you want to tie between them.
See,
I'm always full of questions. Right, Brent. One of the things that I loved about your paper, I kind of love and hate the imprecatory psalms as well. But one of the things that I liked about your presentation was how you were talking about God's body and God's body taking those blows, and which kind of reminded me of something that John Goldingay writes about this whole atonement idea, that you kind of like absorb the pain into yourself. And okay, this is a little bit of a devil's advocate question, big surprise there, but in a manner of speaking, there is something in me that as a nice little Christian person, I don't want to inflict any more suffering on God. So even if that's the way he's chosen to do it, then maybe I should just keep it to myself, right?
Yeah.
Any comments on that?
No, I see that, and I get it too in various teaching contexts that I've done, whether in churches or in classrooms. And I think it's a feeling we have to sort of out pious God, as it were, and that to me, the way to answer such a thing is to just wonder what makes us think that we're better than the psalmist, or that we can, do life better than the psalmist, or for those who operate within a Christian context, of course, if even Christ can't make it through with life without a lament psalm or two, then certainly we're not going to be able to make it through life without a lament psalm or two. So I think that since the canonical criterion of the importance of the canon is a witness to not only the people of God's faith in history and through time and all the rest, but also as a kind of a sanctioned speech, shows that in fact we don't have to out pious the saints of Scripture, as it were. That they, Job is not a saint because he's filled with bitterness. He is equally a saint, and precisely because of his bitterness. And all the rest, So I think that's how is that kind of where you're going? And
that's a great answer. Yeah, thank you. I just anticipate me being asked that at some point, so now I've got an answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's right. In the States, and not just in the States, of course, but really worldwide, this phenomenon of the prosperity gospel that sort of in its worst iterations, imagines a life free of anything remotely sad or negative or whatever. I just remember it's a positive psychologist theorist saying the only people that don't experience normal emotions of unhappiness are those who are either the dead, or who are those who are psychologically in a, a bipolar mode of hysteria. But everyone else, normal, like people living day-to-day life aren't experiencing that or are alive. You experience profound unhappiness as well as part of life and whatnot. And so, no doubt it's reflected in Scripture, and that's a good thing. And to act like it's not is to try to do humanity better than what humanity already is.
We're nearly out of time. Julie, I just wanted to give you, if there's any final thoughts or reflections you wanted to share.
No, thank you so much. It's great being with you. And yeah, so thank you for holding these spaces. It's so important.
Yes. Well, on that note, then let's give a round of applause to both Brent and Julie.
Thanks a lot.
And, it wouldn't be a proper gathering if we didn't end with some notices. So just to reiterate, our conference continues this evening or in just a few hours for you at 7 p.m. British Summer Time with a panel discussion on the topic of restorative justice. Should the church get involved? I have a feeling the answer is yes, but you'll have to come and find out. We'll be hearing from Valerie Hobbs, Sam Heath, and Nathan Cartagena. In addition, there is just so much going on at the CSBV. We have our own journal. We have our own new book series with Routledge Press,
Cool.
and on the Bible and violence, if you couldn't guess that one. And we're accepting submissions and proposals for both of those. And if you would like to find out more about these and everything else we're doing, if you want to get more involved, if you would like to donate to the work of the center, well, you can find all of that on our website at csbvbristol.org.uk. And with that, that's the end of my notices. Hopefully I'll see you all later today.